This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virch, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please subscribe and give us a like. Today, we have an amazing guest, Billie Flynn, a former friend and colleague of mine. Billie is a fighter pilot and test pilot who began his career as the first Nugget to fly the Canadian CF-18, where he eventually was a squadron and combat commander. He attended the U.S. Navy Test Pilot School, was a Eurofighter Typhoon test pilot, and recently retired after 17 years as an F-35 pilot. And he's currently writing and speaking. Billie, thanks for taking some time to join us.
Terry, it's great to talk again and to catch up. I'm sure we're going to have fun talking about topics that we both love.
It's been a while. So what a career. What are you going to do when you grow up?
So it's funny, you know, I flew fighters for 40 years, starting, as you said, really at F-18 in the beginning of all that, and just really never took a break. And as much as I loved it, that whole lifestyle, you live like a monk for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, it's in my world, 30 plus years of getting up at 5 a.m. to run, to ride, to work out, because that's the lifestyle you have to live in that world and sustain it over time. And now that I'm not flying full time, well, I actually haven't flown at all since my last F-35 flight. You find out there's a lot of other interesting things to do out there in the world, and in the sheltered life that we lived, as exciting as it was, you didn't get to do that. You didn't get to fly fish as much as you wanted. You didn't get to cross-country ski. You didn't get to spend time with your family as you wished. And so I'm really enjoying this new phase of life. I love mentoring. I love lecturing. I love writing. And it's just been exciting. People never believe it because we all think, especially in my world, that flying fifth-generation fighters is as cool as could be. Yet there's just lots of other things that are exciting to do beyond the cockpit.
Yeah, it's so good to hear. I had the same exact experience. I loved what I did. I'm so glad I did it. But now I'm doing writing and some film and TV projects, and I'm working in the energy industry in a couple different capacities. And I love energy is super important. It's what drives life on Earth. And so it is really fun to have these other things. But man, flying jets is kind of cool. You know, when I was brand new F-16 pilot, I was at Homestead Air Force Base. It was 1991. I flew with some Cold Lake, you know, the F-5s and the CF-18s would come down into Homestead in January to fly with us, fight us down there.
Yeah, to get away from the harshness of winter.
Yeah. You may have been on that deployment. I don't know. It was 91, 92. But I remember thinking, man, these are the good old days. We had AIM-9s, visual short range heat-seeking missile. And we had Mark 82s, just dumb, unguided bombs. There was no laser targeting pods. There was no AMRAAM radar missiles. And I remember as a 23-year-old going, these are the good old days. And although the jet, what you were flying F-35s are a million times more capable for combat, as a pilot satisfaction, it was pretty fun. Just, you know, you roll in on the target and you're the guy responsible for getting the bomb on the target.
Well, so look, Top Gun Maverick that I'm sure everyone has seen. It's Maverick saying guns only and to do dogfighting. And so like you're referring to, dogfighting was heaters and guns, right? And AIM-9s and guns only, and forget the sophistication. It was you against the next guy or a bunch of you against a bunch of the other guys. And it was just a whole lot of fun. I had never had more fun than BFM.
Yeah,
that is the coolest thing. 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon to go out and fight your buddies or fight a bunch of guys, and then come back home and debrief and go drink beer.
Basic fighter maneuvers. Just one.
Absolutely. It just is the essence of flying. And you know, even in fifth gen world, we have to teach those primary skills. So basic fighting maneuvers still matter, even in an era where you can never imagine actual combat happening with a fifth gen F-22 or F-35, but you have to go to the basics and teach those skills. So you're still out there in an F-35 doing BFM.
Sometimes someone might sneak through, or it may be a visual VID scenario. You never know. Hopefully not, but you may be out of AMRAAMs, you know, if it's launch the fleet kind of day. So I was at Tyndall a couple days ago, actually, it was the Air Force. It's the 75th anniversary of the U.S. Air Force this year. And so I did a speech at the Air Force Ball, and I got to fly the F-22 in the simulator. Unfortunately, they don't make any two-seaters. It was a blast. It was really fun. That airplane, I want to talk lots of 5th gen stuff, but anyway, I remember when it first came out, I was at Edwards, and the only jet that could sort of keep up with it was the Block 50 F-16, you know, but even that couldn't keep up with it. The thrust to weight was just so ridiculous.
And so we're going to get to 5th gen, but helping people understand that our measure of airplanes, fighters at least, and how good they were was really all about kinematics. And it goes back to Korea era, first fighter jet powered airplanes, to then all of a sudden we mastered going supersonic in the Century series fighters. That means everything was F-100 up through F-106. Really, a lot of it was measured about how fast you could go. We get into the Vietnam era in the 3rd generation, where airplanes need to be maneuverable again, can't just go fast, but they got to be able to turn in circles and dogfight, but also increase the sophistication of what you did in the cockpit. To 4th gen, which is what you flew and I flew. I was at Edwards from 1990 to 94, almost 5 years at the F-16 Combined Test Force as a test pilot out there, flying this amazing F-16. I'm an F-18 guy, which was a great 4th gen airplane. There's F-15s in that era, and so on. They were really about multi-role, 1 or 2 people doing missions, not just air-to-air dogfighting, if you will, for the non-aviators, or to ground, dropping bombs, and all of those in one cockpit. Then you step to 5th gen, and you make a quantum leap where, yes, the F-22 goes super fast, super cruises, but that's really not what makes it omnipotent. What makes it omnipotent is stealth, not being able to be detected, or at least until very late. Harry Potter and the cloak of invisibility helps in the analogy sometimes. And then sensor fusion, and sensor fusion is this really sophisticated filtering of all the information from everything that the airplane sees into very simple displays for a single person to understand, prioritize, and react to. And that sensor fusion theme makes the very, very difficult task of filtering lots of sensors and lots of information into a very simple task of, here's the good guys, here's the bad guys, go kill the bad guys. Right. And you know, F-22 dominated for many years, taken over or joined now by F-35. Wow, orders of magnitude more lethal, more survivable, more capable than what you and I flew operationally, or even as we saw as test guys at Edwards.
No, I was never, I want to get into 5th gen. I remember one mission in the F-16, excuse me, I was in Korea. We had Lantern, which was this system, you could fly low altitude at night. There was a radar that followed the terrain. And then there was an infrared camera. You see these Army, Navy SEALs with the little night vision goggles. Well, we had one, it was like looking through a straw, we used to say. And I was leading a 4-ship. It was a check ride. So I was leading a 4-ship of F-16s. We were going to drop laser guided bombs on a simulated target in Korea, and we had some bad guys. So there was other fighter jets out there as our simulating North Korean fighter jets. And you had to navigate using the radar display and the infrared camera. You had to find the target using this infrared camera. You had a radar to look for the air-to-air targets. You had to look at the missile information. Can you shoot them or not? You had radar warning receiver that would tell you if guys were targeting you. So there's like 4 or 5 different sensors, and the sensor fusion was done in my brain. And when I got done with that, I remember thinking, this is the busiest a human being can be. Like, it's impossible. And by the way, the ground's a few hundred feet below me and it's pitch black outside. I came away, I still remember that sortie thinking, this is the busiest a human can be. And that's really the advantage, I think, of the F-35, F-22, all that. Instead of having your brain we used to call it doing the lobster eye, right? You're having to look here and look there in different places. Doing the lobster eye to the merge, one eye on the radar screen, another eye looking out the window to try and find the bad guys.
I'm going to use that, the lobster eye. That's good.
Oh, yeah, that was an F-16 saying.
So perfect tangent, because we're going to go talk about missing the ground and pilot workload. We saw really early on fourth gen, that you could overwhelm a pilot with the workload. That you, and back in the day, there was a debate, should there be one pilot in the cockpit, or do you need two? But it was always going to come down to the human being unable to prioritize, to understand, to filter, to synthesize all the information that was given to them. And it was given, as you said, in 4 or 5 different displays, and you're the machine, you are the computer that's trying to manage all that. And no matter how good you were, by the way, video game kids back in my day, oh, that was Pong and Space Invaders, right? F-18 in the beginning was powered by 2 Commodore 64 computers as the mission computers.
I was a missile command guy a few years later.
So it wasn't impressive, but all of that, you know, compared to now, it's Halo 5 and Grand Theft Auto and so much more, and an F-35 with 8.6 million lines of code. Yeah. But back in the day, we overwhelmed the human. So I was on the very first CF-18 course, as you said. I was the first kid picked out of pilot training, really as a guinea pig project to go through training, never flown anything else, to see if I could adapt to the F5. And then in my class were a bunch of us in the same boat, but I'm the first of them. We're going to be the first squadron in Canada. The most talented pilot we had. Went to weapons school, so Top Gun grad, superb fighter pilot, married, kids at home, amazing talent, wonderful guy. He's doing an intercept in a CF-18 on a T-33 old airplane at 1,000 feet above the ground in Cold Lake, Alberta. So he's trying to intercept this guy from up high with his now radar, and there's clouds around, and he comes arcing down to chase this T-33, head in the cockpit, in and out of cloud, and he buries himself in the tundra of Cold Lake going 700 knots. And we essentially never found much of the body and much of him. Completely overwhelmed by the information in front of him. First fatality, it's 2 months into the very first course in Canada. And so the real it was bad enough, but 5 minutes before, in a different part of the range in Cold Lake, a major on our squadron, very talented man, very experienced, did the same thing, doing the same task, almost had the same result. In the case of the major, he came out of the clouds, and the HUD video is astonishing. The heads-up display video from there. You hear a gasp. He grabs the control stick with 2 hands. He pulls it back in his lap, and he pulls 11.2 G, missed the ground by 192 feet. I think I still have that right. Going 700 something knots before the F-18 had a 7.2 G limiter, and he misses the ground. So 5 minutes before our first fatality, a guy almost did the same thing. Because pilots are just overwhelmed. There's just a lot of stuff happening. You put, like your example, at night, and then take away the visual references of the ground, and it gets that much more complicated, and so on and so forth. And that leads us into, so my first experience, and later in life, I spent years working on, how do we stop pilots from hitting the ground? How do we stop airplanes from crashing into the ground? The phenomena is known as controlled flight into terrain. You remember, I think at Edwards, the projects that were going on separate where you were at the F-16 were guys over on the AFD F-16 probably. So a special F-16 project working on automatic ground collision avoidance, trying to figure out how to let an airplane see the ground and miss the ground. And we worked on these technologies over years to now get to a point where it's in F-16s and F-35s and soon to be F-18s, where we'll prevent pilots from hitting the ground.
F-22 has a light version of that. It's not quite as good, but it does have, after 2 CFIT incidents, right after I left, guy at Edwards doing a test point, did a split S into the ground. Guy up in Alaska got disoriented, which I found it's super easy to over alpha to go to too high an angle of attack in that airplane. I did it in the sim on my first BFM setup. And anyway, so to go back to Korea, that check ride, when I was so busy, I had been there for a few months doing that. My very first sortie. So we had a guy at Luke Air Force Base in the first Lantern F-16. He was doing a low altitude at night, laser guided bomb attack. He was real low. He pulls up to loft the bomb at the target, and then you roll over to kind of bring the jet back down to the ground. You want to stay close to the ground so the radars don't see you. And he got disoriented and flew the jet into the ground. Fatality in the F-16. So we had a hard and fast rule. 10 miles out, you took over and you flew manually. So you're flying the jet, looking through the soda straw of the infrared camera. 4, 5, 6, whatever miles out, you do the loft. You're flying manually. You roll over, you put it back on, you give it back to the autopilot. Now the jet is flying itself. And then you look down at the targeting pod. So you're either flying the jet looking at the ground, like you're driving, not texting, or you can park and then you can text, right? You give the jet to the autopilot and then you can start slowing it. The very first one I did solo, I'd been doing it with an instructor in the back. Now I'm solo, whatever. It's nighttime, 10 miles. I take over manual and I immediately look at the targeting pod and start slowing it on the target. And about 30 seconds later, pull up, Betty. We had bitchin' Betty. This lady in the cockpit's yelling and screaming at me. My head are between my knees. And I was flying right at a hill. I literally did the exact thing you weren't supposed to do. As soon as I took over to fly manually, I started getting distracted and texting while I'm driving, basically. And I would have hit the hill had I not had that radar pod. The Lantern had a special radar pod that was looking for the ground. It saw that I was about to hit the ground. And then it pulled me up and saved my life. I need all my fingers and toes to tell. You probably need more than that. The times you almost died. But that was Auto-GCAS, really.
It was
Except for
manual warning. Yeah, manual warning.
But it flew me up.
You.
It took over the jet. It actually took over the jet in the Lantern.
Oh, okay. So one of the things we've learned, so the history, because we're going to jump right into it, auto ground collision avoidance, which again, I jumped ahead and said it's in these airplanes. Now, back in the 80s, the United States Air Force and the Swedish Defense Forces worked on they were working on an automatic bombing system, and then they realized they were close to the ground. So kind of like you're talking about, doing it all, dropping a bomb automatically and profiles like that, but they realized they were close to the ground. So they started looking at, well, how does the aircraft avoid the ground? And they developed a system probably in the early 90s. You and I would have remembered hearing about it at test pilot conferences, where the system started to work. They started to understand that they could predict where the airplane was. They knew what the ground was like. They could tell you where the airplane was going to go, and then they knew how to take over from the pilot and fly the aircraft away from the terrain. But there were a lot of problems back in those days. When you and I flew F-16s back in the early 90s, there wasn't GPS like we all have in our phones, and it wasn't like in all airplanes now. They were inertial navigation systems. We plugged in where we were we thought we were on the Earth, and as you flew, those systems could move away, could drift as much as a mile an hour, and you weren't over the same spot that you thought you were. You were probably close, but do a 3-hour mission and you're potentially 3 miles off where you ought to be. Our mapping of the Earth wasn't very sophisticated in the day. You and I in the military thought we had a super sophisticated system, as good as anywhere in the world. And later, the research team I was on for Auto-GCAS completely debunked that. And we're going to talk about some shuttle radar topography
SRTM
data, SRTM. So this system existed, but it really wasn't sophisticated. And when it was proposed to the Air Force to be put in the F-16 and F-15, it was going to cost $500 million to retrofit airplanes. And nobody bought into that. And so it sat on the shelf. In about the same time frame, about 2006 or so, at Lockheed Martin, we were building an F-16 unique to the UAE Air Force in F-16 parlance. And you know the airplane, but for other people, it's the E and F model of the F-16. Doesn't exist in America. We call it Block 60. In Block 60's development, super sophisticated King Kong F-16 of all time, we developed an automatic ground collision avoidance system based on that work that had been done in the 80s. I call it the 78% solution. It was really pretty good, very effective. The human factors part of it was well done. It exists in the airplane, and although we never had a system to track how often it saved people in the UAE, I'm certain it worked a lot. But at the same time, there was a team put together, Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. Everybody would know them, the notoriety from the F-104 to the U-2, the SR-71,
Right.
to the F-117 stealth fighter. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works engineers, the Air Force Research Labs, the US Air Force, obviously, and some folks at the NASA facility, then called NASA Dryden at Edwards, put us all together. I became part of that team to mature the technologies that had laid dormant for a number of years. And in that time frame, it's when I did the flying, it was 2009 to 2010. We'd matured our navigation systems. We didn't have inertial navigation systems. We had GPSs, just like you and I have on our phone. And oh, by the way, in fighter jets, they're supremely accurate in 3 dimensions. Our navigation, our terrain database became really sophisticated, courtesy of the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission, SRTM data, taken years before. What was that? STS
99 in 1999, I think.
Yeah, and the data in the beginning was great, but it was never meant to be used by pilots. And when they found out what it was going to be used for, the people that owned the data really was scratching their heads. It was meant for forestry and mining applications, but really never meant to be as a database for fighter jets. Over a couple of years, they massaged the data, fixed the errors in it, and it became our database, and it was nearly flawless when we put it in there. So we knew where we were. We weren't drifting off a mile an hour anymore.
Right.
The database, so the terrain, the hills, the valleys, were flawless in what we knew. 80% of the Earth's surface, I think, was mapped by in that mission. And then our prediction of where the aircraft was going to go and how it would recover and fly away from an object became that much more sophisticated. We knew how to maneuver the airplane. If it was upside down, we knew how to roll it up right and then pull, and how to make those algorithms work better. So we knew where we were, GPS. We knew the terrain, SRTM data, and our prediction of where we were going to hit was more sophisticated. We put that all together in an F-16D, a 2-seat F-16. We flew it out of NASA Dryden, now called NASA Armstrong at Edwards. This team of 4 test pilots and fabulous engineers in a 2-year period matured the technology. And we didn't have the 78% solution anymore. We had the 98% solution. Flawless. And when this system took over, whether you're flying too low over a desert floor or you're flying at a mountain range, a wall, when it took over, it was inside where you and I and our human tolerance would have tolerated. And I know this because before every flight, we practiced it on a very simple profile. We wanted to activate the system to make sure it was working before we did testing, and we'd fly close to the ground, and it was always taking over.
Second seat cushion.
Oh my Lord, I was ready to pull up each time it took over.
Right.
So when it takes over, you're going to die.
Right.
And it just takes over and bumps you away from the ground, and then it gives it back to you each time. We have, it finishes this project, we'll say 2011, the F-16 wants it, so it goes to the F-16 Combined Test Force at Edwards, the test squadron you were a part of and I was part of, and they take another 2.5, 3 years to mature it, put in the F-16. We have this great system, but people really aren't buying off on it. It's really not getting the attention we want. But in 2014, a young Dutch student doing his training on the F-16 in Tucson, Arizona, blacks himself out, 8.3 G, I think is where he's at. He blacks himself out in a dogfight with his instructor. So he's blacked out. You can hear the instructor yelling at him. He's asleep. He's unconscious, and the jet takes over because he's going to hit the ground, and the jet flies away from the ground. That videotape gets released to the public. We knew it for a while, but really at one point, I think you've heard me say it, I believe it's Guy North from Aviation Week that really got the attention to it, and then it became essentially viral. And all of a sudden people are going, holy cow, this system works. It goes from the F-16. There's a longer story how we eventually get it in the F-35. There's a version you said that's in the F-22, not as sophisticated, lots of program arguments why it wasn't like we have, but it's in there. And since that time, It has saved 11 F-16s and 12 F-16 pilots. Everybody, you're a math guy, I'm a math guy. We can figure out that that's not right, but it's a 2-seat F-16 where folks were disoriented. It saved an F-22 in June of 2020 in Alaska. It saved an F-35. And now with some help from some F-35 test pilots that I flew with, it's going into the Navy's finally relented in the United States Marine Corps, and we'll get it in the legacy F-18s, starting testing this fall. And the Navy for the Super Hornet also starting this fall, and the Navy and Marine Corps guys will get it. So I've talked about it before. You and I both have interest in it because we've seen it. But lots of people go, so what? You're a bunch of fighter guys, and yes, you hit the ground, but it's kind of your world. What's the application to us? And the application to everybody on the street is controlled flight into terrain still kills people in passenger airplanes.
Yeah.
88% of the people that die in passenger airplanes come from controlled flight into terrain. And so there are ones that are really interesting. In Pakistan, Air Blue 202 in the 28th of July, 2012 is an Airbus airplane in flying in Pakistan where the pilots get confused, bad weather, and crash into a mountain and kill 140 plus people on board. There's an accident in the Arctic just a couple of years ago where pilots get disoriented and crash. Until we put this system in civilian airliners, we are all at risk in flying around the world with a system that could save airplanes and prevent airplanes from ever crashing into the ground again with the system that we matured now more than 10 years ago.
Yeah, it makes my head explode when airliners don't put that in. It doesn't happen that often, but it happens. And when it happens, 100 people or 200 people die. They have a system that will yell at you. The pilot hears pull up, but unless he knows which direction up is, unless he does the right procedure, and unless he's like conscious and ready to do it, it wouldn't do it. I have my own personal experience with Auto-GCAS back in the 90s. Unfortunately, some of my good friends, G-locked and flew the jet into the ground. I know too many people like that, especially in the F-16. But I think it was 2000. I was in the 416th F-16 test pilot, and they brought Auto-GCAS out. There was like a beta version of Auto-GCAS, and they said, go scare yourself. So we went and flew down the Kern River. There's this valley right near Edward. It's like the Top Gun Maverick River is what it is. And they were like, scare yourself. And they figured out you want to save yourself by 10 feet or 50 feet or 500 feet. There were some margins, and they were like, set it to 0. That's what they learned. So like, it wasn't going to have any false alarms. You barely had any protection. Billy, I could not get the thing to activate. I tried to fly lower than I possibly thought I could, and I just couldn't fly that low. And you get the little arrows come in, and when they touch, it pulls you up, and I could never get them to touch. Like it would like, you're just about to get it. You're just about to get it. But it was such a good system. Like you talked about in the beginning, it would save you. And I came out of that. I mean, we had the Undersecretary of the Air Force was there. And I was like, he was really on board with it. And the Air Force said, no, we can't afford it. Like you said, it was a couple $100 million. And I had a friend at ACC headquarters, which is the Fighter Command headquarters. And I called him up. I'm like, dude. And he said, man, we looked at it. It's just too expensive. I'm like, how expensive are pilots? I got picked to be an astronaut. I go to NASA. A few months later, the guy that replaced me in the 416th, he had sat in my office, flew his F-16 into the ground. He was testing these air launch decoys, and one of them malfunctioned and it went straight down. So he went into this big, whifferdille to wrapped himself around, and he just flew the jet into the ground with a guy in the back seat, a civilian photographer. F-22 a few years later flew itself into the ground. So I was jumping up and down. It was my soapbox, but I was off to NASA. I wasn't in the Air Force anymore, so I didn't have any input. So while you were doing your thing, I was kind of out of the loop. And then I remember reading in Aviation Week, it might have been Guy North's article, and it basically said over the last decade, the Air Force has lost, it was something like 18 F-16s and 19 pilots. that would have been saved had they had Auto-GCAS. And then very shortly after that, they came out with this. So fast forward a few years, there was this kid when I was at Spangdahlem. He was in high school. He was in my youth group at church. Then he went to the Air Force Academy and visited us at Edwards. And then he grew up to be an F-16 pilot, lived in and anyway, so I've been friends with this guy. He was an instructor pilot in Tucson. He calls me up. He's like, Flanders, you'll never believe it. Your Auto-GCAS system just saved my backseater. That video that you're talking about was him.
Oh,
the European pilot.
yeah.
That was he called me that afternoon, so excited that Auto-GCAS had saved this guy. And when you watch it, you get goosebumps. For those not watch, or whoever's listening, Google F-16 aeroplanes save, and you'll find the video. It's just incredible. Guy puts himself to sleep, like has happened 100 times or 1,000 times. In the computer, he would have hit the ground going Mach 2, and the computer pulls up, and he went home to his wife and kids that night because of that. So
he did. And it isn't, so it isn't always because people black themselves out.
yeah, right.
Spatial disorientation. So you talked about night in Korea and super busy,
Right.
or your lantern example.
Right.
You just get disoriented, and
Right.
it's bad weather, it's dark, or you just get messed up in your head.
Right.
And I used to open my Auto-GCAS talk with a video. It was an animation of an accident that happened in the Middle East in a combat deployment where a very seasoned pilot took off, and a minute and a half later, he's dead.
Yeah.
Because he can't figure out what's going on in his cockpit. And, you know, there's demons going on as your head's trying to figure out where you're at.
Yep.
And he just flew himself into the ground. Often the warnings that you talked about that tell you that you should pull up, they're screaming in your head, but the man or woman is just so confused that they
You don't
just
know which
don't
way's
know
up.
what up is and how
Yeah.
to react. We have found in the analysis of all those accidents in that research team that I was a part of, which by the way, is part of all the groups that won the Collier Trophy in 2018, the National Aeronautics Association really is the ultimate award in
big
aviation.
deal. Yeah, it's a big deal.
Auto-GCAS won it, and after
they deserved it.
For all the teams essentially that were part of this.
Yeah.
Those teams looked at all the accidents and realized that the airplanes were functioning perfectly, but the pilots were just so confused. Well, they may have been blacked out, but they were also, if they were conscious, they were just so confused at what's going on. They just couldn't figure it out. So spatial disorientation is a real part of it. Come back to the Kern River, because Top Gun Maverick, we've all seen it. They're all flying super low. Some of it's in or around that area that you're talking about, and some of it's up north near Reno. In this project that I had, theoretically, our limit was 100 feet. And we did that route that you and I have both flown for years, clockwise one day, counterclockwise the other day. It's basically up the Sierra Nevadas, across the valley, north of China Lake, down Panamint Valley, which is between China Lake and Death Valley, back to Edwards, and you go the other way depending on the day of the week. And essentially we had no rules. It was sort of 100 feet, but really it wasn't 100 feet. And really it was, you fly as low as you think you can. And down that Kern River, where I had no rules, I could never fly low enough to activate it.
I couldn't either. I only did it once. You probably did it 100 times. Yeah.
I had thousands of hours, or
Right.
a couple thousand hours in the F-16. I just couldn't get down that low. There were hills all over, your S turning all over the place, down these walls. Yeah, I couldn't get it low enough. I will tell you that at the very end of Auto-GCAS, so I'm on this research team for 2 years. We've done this amazing development. The system works, everything's come together, and all the technologies works. And we know that we are going to change the world with this technology. Finally, after so many years, these engineers that had been on the teams for so long, I went out and in my F-16 with no one in the back seat, I intentionally flew at a rock, as we call it, GCAS Mountain, a place that we've surveyed over many years. We knew everything about it, and I knew the system knew it flawlessly. And I flew at the rock intentionally to force it, and I missed the ground.
You
I missed
made
the ground
activate.
by 19 feet. I missed the rock by 19
Jeez.
feet, and I knew I had to create the video, because no one, some officer, someplace, some colonel, some general was going to question how good it really was. So I created the video that said, this is how good it is. You're not going to die with this thing. It's going to be better than the human. And it's an impressive video because there's a lot of rock face in front of me. And then all of a sudden the airplane bounces over top of it and I fly away. We had to create something so compelling that it couldn't be downgraded in some boardroom someplace when someone saw it.
You know what we found in 2000, and we got so much pushback from the patchwares, the operational weapon school guys, is combat capability. We can't put $500 million into safety. We need combat capability. We need more weapons, more bombs, more, combat capability is what they called. Well, who has shot down 19 F-16s a decade? I mean, the Taliban didn't, the Iraqis didn't, the US Army shot down an airplane or two from fratricide, but we just don't lose fighters to enemy fire very often, if ever. And we lose them all the time to accidents. You talk about combat capability. That's an entire, how would Canada like to have 18 F-16s? Like that would be a significant upgrade for their Air Force.
So think about a couple things, right? What's the combat capability? You just lost a 32-year-old seasoned fighter pilot. You replace that.
That's
it takes
millions
3
of
years to
dollars
build a
in
fighter
decade.
and 26 years to build a fighter pilot. There's your combat capability.
Yeah.
In Canada, there have been 16 fatal CF-18 crashes over the many years. Right. 7 of them could have been saved by CFIT.
Yeah.
So where's your combat capability? I completely agree with you. The
How
US
many did
Navy,
the Taliban shoot down? How many Canadian Hornets?
Well, exactly. So, we've done it to ourselves. The US Navy just refused. And by the way, our friends at Boeing were unable, as hard as they tried to convince them. The Navy just refused to agree or invest in it. The excuse was combat capability. Mm-hmm. And they just killed a Super Hornet just a couple of years ago in that same area that you and I were talking about in California, flying Star Wars Canyons. The airplane fanatics all know about it. The photographers all go there. And a young guy hit a wall and hit the rock wall in Star Wars Canyon, where Auto-GCAS would have saved them. What's that worth? Pretty soon it's billions of dollars or it's hundreds of millions of dollars in airplanes, and it's an irreplaceable fighter pilot.
Human, or humans if it's a 2-seater. So it's a big, and so having this in airliners, I think you need to tie in the throttles. In the F-16, it was just.
No, you did. We did.
Oh, you did.
Well, sorry. In the legacy F-16, you didn't. But in Block 60, in F-35, it's tied to the throttles. Now, you and I would think that a pull-up, so for the non-aviators, let's assume you're pulling at the ground and you probably want the power to come up to help you pull up to miss the ground. But it turns out that most of these recoveries, when the system activates, it happens pretty quickly. These are not 1-minute iterations or 36 second iterations. They're like 7 seconds. They're 4 seconds. I don't even think they're 15 seconds. The pull-ups to miss the ground are pretty quickly. The throttle would help, but there's usually enough kinetic energy. The airplane's generally going fast enough to recover from the ground and then have the human wake up again and take over.
Well, I'm thinking if he doesn't wake up, or if they're still disoriented, or if they have a heart attack, or who knows, to be able to, there's a lot of things. And like you said, the airlines are very safe, and Boeing is extreme, and Airbus, there are 2 airline manufacturers. They're extremely not willing to put money into things because then they lose the competition to the other company. But
I think in the end, it'll be the insurance companies that force it. It'll be the insurance companies that tell Boeing, look, you lost 346 people in 2 737 MAX accidents. Here's a system that would save us all this money we had to dish out. You need to develop a system like that. I think that's who's going to push this in the commercial world. Right.
Well, it's an amazing thing. It saves lives. So thank you for the work you did on it, because literally that's like the work that you did is saving lives. So that's super important. We talked about 5th-gen fighters, and I want to jump back to that because it's super cool. Had a chance to go to Luke Air Force Base last year and spoke at an F-35 graduation. And Luke Air Force Base, it's like, as far as you can see, 5th-gen F-35s. It's like a Hollywood movie set, only it's real. In fact, they told me that Luke Air Force Base is actually the 2nd largest 5th-gen Air Force on Earth behind the U.S. Air Force. The only organization that has more 5th gen fighters than Luke Air Force Base is the rest of the U.S. Air Force. But in seeing what's happening in Ukraine, it makes me sick. It needs to end as soon as possible. This is just evil. And I think a squadron of F-35s, give them a few weeks. It's an amazing capability.
I also went to Luke and gave a grad speech earlier this spring. I was amazed. So I'm 5'10", 5'11". There's a grad picture with me, with myself and the Norwegian lieutenants and one U.S. Air Force fighter pilot. So I'm 5'10", 5'11", and I look like I've shrunk compared to these Norwegian Vikings next to me. They're young lieutenants, and they probably do all the dumb things that 23, 24-year-olds do.
Right.
Yet they, as young fighter pilots, are more capable by an order of magnitude than you and I ever were, or anyone we ever knew in a legacy 4th generation fighter. The best we ever were is not on the scale of what those young lieutenants are capable of doing in a 5th generation fighter, courtesy of this amazing airplane and obviously fabulous training at Luke these days, very mature, understanding what a 5th gen fighter is supposed to do. They don't do the stuff that we did our lives. They don't drop little blue bombs, little dumb bombs at the ground that fall ballistically. They don't worry about firing their gun or shooting their AIM-9 Sidewinder as a major part of their weapon system. They have highly sophisticated weapons. They see everything out there. They know that they're necessarily not detectable. And it's like playing football when your team's invisible and the other team's not. And they don't win by just a little bit. They dominate. It's necessarily 20-1 is what you can figure 5th gen is to legacy platforms, legacy fighters. And so, yeah, they mop up in everything. In the most complex scenarios ever imagined. Ukraine, full-on Ukraine, surface-to-air missiles looking for the bad guys, bad guys in the air. And these are the kind of folks that F-35 and even these young lieutenants are capable of walking in, destroying the enemy, walking out without ever being detected.
Right.
And that's what a 5th gen aircraft does. It's not a war of attrition like you and I remember from the Cold War. That was, the Eastern Bloc was there. We knew NATO forces would have amassed. I flew out of southern Germany when Canadians had 2 bases there south of Ramstein.
What was the base? The Canadian base?
Baden-Solingen and Lahr. Baden-Solingen.
Lahr. Yeah.
And Lahr was south of there. So 2 bases, 40 miles apart. My dad flew actually in the same dispersal.
That's awesome.
As I flew, my mom and dad. My mom served also, and I went to the same church as my mom and dad got married in. And
that's amazing.
In the day, all the NATO forces would have got up, right? And you would have had this fight in the middle, and whoever was left standing would have gone back, got gas, and the next one would have. That's a war of attrition. That's not what you do in F-35. That's not what would happen in Ukraine if you had enough F-35s and sent them in to clean up. Yeah. And they would have destroyed everything on the ground, anything that dared fly in the air. There'd be nothing left. And this would all end pretty quickly. Now, Ukraine's a massive territory, so that's unrealistic to say it could happen today, but the effectiveness of what they are is astonishing.
Yeah, the amount of combat capability that Russia would lose within days and weeks would be almost complete. And here's a tangent. 1994, the US and the UK guaranteed Ukraine's security when they gave up their nuclear weapons. So in my mind, that means we should guarantee their security, but that's a different topic for a different day. We're not the only one with 5th gen fighters. What can you talk about Russia and China and Top Gun Maverick, right? Top Gun Maverick, because everyone saw the Sukhoi, so Su as we say it in short term, 57, their 5th gen fighter doing this massive, an astonishing thrust vectoring type move in front of Maverick and the Tomcat, Maverick and Rooster, and they're going like, what the heck was that? And it's really not that capable. And they've started a program that's really languished for a long time. What everybody
in the East meaning Russia, and I'll include China in that, has done is look at what America's done and essentially it. And so you get pictures of an F-22 or an F-35, and you start building airplanes that look like that. And you assume that the shapes that they are must reflect radar energy, essentially. That's why most people think it's not able to be seen. It's stealthy. And so you just build airplanes like that. And they build airplanes that probably go super fast. And there'll be a lot of them. So I'll mention the conversation about quantity is a quality unto itself. If China sends up 3 times as many as we have, even if they're vastly inferior, we're shooting 3 times more than is out there, and we got our hands full. So a couple of things that are lost. One is the sophistication of manufacturing here in the United States and within the partnership of F-35. Lockheed built the F-117 stealth fighter that you know well, and that people saw in the first Gulf War. And by the way, it was built before anyone ever knew it existed.
Right.
It was tested, flown, and was flying operationally
in the 70s. Yeah.
And that's people are starting to learn about how to build a stealth airplane and manufacture it. And what they learn, the goods and the bads, gets applied to F-22, this air dominance airplane that has essentially never gets beat.
Right.
Master of air to air. And then what was learned in F-22 migrates to F-35. And now we have 40 years of manufacturing expertise on how to build stealth technologies, how to design things, how to repair them, how to do coatings. You don't paint a fighter jet anymore, you coat them. All of those lessons learned tell me, and it took us 40 years to get to this point, if you're in China, you're going to build an airplane that looks like an F-22 and F-35, but you're not catching up to 40 years of know-how of the smartest minds in American aerospace. You're not getting that in 5 or 10 years. So
there's propulsion and there's avionics.
Huge. So propulsion, Pratt & Whitney and General Electric and here for us, and all the advances in what are in the F-35, the F-117 engine, the F-135, which powers the F-35, 43,000 pounds of thrust, the most powerful fighter engine ever. And it's like a commercial engine, not fragile like the fighter engines that you and I flew in, the T-38 or the F-5, the F-18 or the F-16. It has the robustness, but then the power of the generations. You don't have that in China or Russia. You have old school. Not in F-35.
Right.
No, as much it didn't earn its way on the airplane.
Right.
And I did thrust vectoring in the F-16 in the early 90s, and I flew the NASA high alpha research vehicle with thrust vectoring. Flew against X-31, had thrust vectoring back in the early 90s. I was a big proponent of thrust vectoring. It didn't earn its way onto F-35 is the way to get it. So you can't do what an F-22 can do, but go watch an F-35 air show flown by the US Air Force and you'll be convinced you didn't really need it. So propulsion, no way China and Russia is going to catch us anytime soon. And then you and I talked about pilot workload and sensor fusion. You're not going to catch up on that anytime soon. There is no way on God's green earth that sophistication is going to migrate into a Chinese or Russian airplane after all the work that has been done by the super smart engineers here in the West to finesse it first in F-22 and now in F-35. So we have 10, 15 years of sophistication that they're just not, as long as we protect our technologies, isn't going to get caught up on.
That's the big one. That's a big if, or that's a big must.
So
counter
really
espionage.
Look, the U.S. Air Force that you were a part of really understands how to manage classification of systems, how to manage, spy planes essentially, and that's certainly what F-35 is. But F-22 has been kept in the U.S. Air Force. Everything's done in vaults, which means it's all protected information, and it never gets out of there and never gets compromised. F-35 has been sold around the world. It'll be a franchise program, much like the F-16 was. And all of a sudden, it's not in the hands of the United States services anymore. It's in Norway, soon to be Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Greece, Canada, Australia, Korea, Japan. I missed something in there.
Canada?
Oh, finally, Canada. Oh, dear Lord.
Are they going to do it?
Yep, 88 of them.
Mm.
Contract will be signed this fall.
Mar-a-Lago?
It won't be.
Sorry, did I say that out loud?
Yeah, you did. You did.
The
How do we
Mar-a-Lago
protect
stuff.
that? And how do you teach people in Belgium or in Canada that it's not an F-16 or an F-18? It's a spy plane. And if you let this out, any part of this gets compromised, you gave China a 10-year, 15-year leap forward that they're incapable of getting on their own.
Right.
So that the heart of the saving F-35 and our technological achievement and the advancements that we have is protecting it, the cyber protection of that platform and those systems.
That's why we didn't let the F-22. I'm sure Lockheed would love to have sold F-22s to England or Japan.
Japan in the day, Australia.
Yeah. I don't think everybody knows China's a threat. I don't think they understand the degree to which they're a threat. Like I said, I'm working in the energy industry, and everywhere they are trying and often succeeding in learning technology. It's a massive threat that you just need to be aware of. It's not just hyperbole. It's a real threat. And so loss, if we lose that, that's a serious loss.
Absolutely. And so I'm glad you brought up China, because I think we all obviously look at Ukraine now, and we always knew Russia was an issue. Not everybody believed they were super nice, but China's a threat. And in America, we understand that. The United States gets that China's a threat. Canada doesn't. Yet in the Arctic, as climate change affects access and increases access to the natural resources and the wealth that is in the Arctic, China's a threat there. China considers themselves a near Arctic nation. It isn't just Russia that's the threat to the Arctic exploitation. It's actually China. Oh, by the way, who are building nuclear icebreakers. Not sure why they would need that, except to go to places like in the Arctic. So it's a threat in places like Canada, and obviously all the way down in Asia. There really is a threat. But to us in the Western world, we need to pay attention to China, because they're just sitting there lurking. And every time they can steal our technologies, they just gave themselves a 10-year leap forward.
And that happens all the time. So I want to follow down this path and talk 6th gen and what's coming next. I forget the acronym, but it reminds. So back in the 90s, it was probably when I was at Spangdahl, 97, maybe the Paris Air Show. I saw a Su-35, I think, with canards, thrust vectoring, and the flanker is an amazing air. It has 8 hours of gas. I mean, those guys can just hang around forever. It carries all these big giant missiles. The flanker was our big threat in the 90s. And this thing, it just had an anti-gravity machine. I mean, it flew over center stage, and it was kind of sloppy, and then it flew away. And I was like, wow, I don't want to get in a dogfight with that. But then a Block 50 F-16 came in and did a solo demo, and it was so much more precise. You could tell the Russian flight controls were really sloppy. And then when you get in the cockpit, and you've seen flanker cockpits, it's like going back to Vietnam. It's like being in a Vietnam F4. Whereas the F-16 is a pretty modern air, especially Block 60. We used to always joke, man, I hope Congress doesn't know we're making these Block 60s, because if they do, they'll cancel the F-35. It was such a good airplane. And it's really so I guess the point I'm making is, airplanes can maneuver, but man, the avionics are that's the difference. And then with that thought, what do you think about that? Let's move on to 6th gen and what's coming next.
Next gen air dominance, NGAD, is what 6th gen is.
Yeah.
So I said about F-35. Kinematics is what we all think about in 4th gen. An F-16 goes 800 knots. It goes 2.05 Mach. It pulls 9G. And F-18 goes 725 knots and 1.7, 1.8 Mach. And it pulls 7.5 G, but it flies super slow at air shows. And, the public understands how good airplanes are by how good the air show is that's flown in front of them.
Right.
That was always our measure of airplanes, and what happened in the cockpit wasn't so important. And then it really changes. Even F-22, which is the most spectacular air show anyone will ever see, really it's stunning what it can do. It doesn't win because of kinematics, about how fast it goes. It wins because the guy or gal in the cockpit sees everything is never seen and knows how to execute the mission. F-35, the same thing. Keep that theme in there, because we do need to change the kinematics a bit in 6th gen, but we still need to be incredibly smart and aware in the cockpit. So what do we need to do? We need to start going faster. We need to stop hanging around at barely supersonic or over supersonic. We need weapons that don't rely just on ballistics anymore and how they fall out of an airplane. We need weapons that go 6 times the speed of sound, and you know
Right.
about hypersonics. And so for everyone, it's not just twice the speed of sound, it's 6 times the speed of sound. It's way
Right.
faster.
That's
Why? Because I
fast.
have to attack the bad guys way far out there, way out there. I have to get there way faster. And my airplane needs to go way faster than it has been before. So I got to go faster. My missiles have to go faster. They have to go further distances. My bombs, or whatever we're attacking on the ground, they have to go out a long distance. There's some kinematics to that. But I also need to go this notion of sensor fusion, simplifying the information, giving it to me in a couple screens in front of me, touchpad, iPad equivalents, and an F-35. I need to enhance that. I need to make it so that all my sensors fit together in all the spectrums, and I just see who the good guys are and the bad guys are, even more than what I have already, so that I'm smarter in the cockpit. And now I can go faster, I can shoot further. And then I'll say, I need to gather information from other sources, not just what's on my airplane or what a airliner size airplane, AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System. What was AWACS meant?
AWACS, yeah, that's it. It was AWACS.
An airliner platform that used to have a big radar that saw further than we all
Dark
did.
Star, yeah.
I need more than that. I need to link to everything in space that can see what's in the area that I care about. Everything on the sea, everything on the ground that has information, maybe undersea. We call it multi-domain operations. I need to see the information from everyone in my cockpit, unfiltered, and then let my system tell me who the good guys are and the bad guys. And all of a sudden I have situational awareness that was unheard of. We couldn't even grasp, you and I.
Right.
I go faster than everyone else. And
it's like video game essay.
Big time. And oh, by the way, I need to start controlling unmanned vehicles that help build that information. So swarms of drones or partner drones that are ahead of me, that are beside me, that are looking in different spectrums than I am and feeding me information. And
so
that's
interesting. You said information. I always thought of them as like they've got extra missiles or whatever, but they also have extra sensors.
Yeah, so maybe I want one of those way far ahead of me gathering reconnaissance information, unseen, but all he's doing is gathering information for me way far ahead and feeding it back to me where I have time to process that as I move into bad guy territory. Maybe I do want someone else out there with more bombs and missiles that I can send besides what I have on board my airplane, so that I'm more lethal in terms of what I can deliver against an enemy. Certainly I'm not flying by ourselves anymore. It's not just piloted airplanes. We want to use the capability of what's out there in unmanned vehicles and link that to us now. We're going to see it in 5th gen. You're really going to see that in 6th gen.
Right. Well, so that'll be interesting. The problem that the US has and is just these programs take forever. Like the F-22 is 30 years old. When I was flying it, I'm like, I'm back at Edwards in the 90s. It was a 90s airplane.
1992, I did the follow-on investigation from the crash of the YF-22 and watched the beginning of, we watched the fly-off of YF-22 and
23 and 22, yeah. So that's over 30 years. So we've been saying, look, we've been saying this probably since Eisenhower was, running the army. We just need to figure out how to get procurement done faster. And I'll tell you, you were talking about your career and all the things you've done. I think the proudest achievement that I have in my over 30 years in the Air Force, I have never been to the Pentagon. I have literally never set foot in the Pentagon. So that's, I flew in Iraq, I flew the shuttle, but the biggest pride that I have is I never went to the Pentagon. But we got to figure out how to do those programs quicker, I think. The one more thing I want to talk about.
Yeah.
And I don't know that much. I'm not involved. I'm completely unclassified civilian right now. how did Russia suck so badly? And that wasn't the word I used in my notes here. Like, I knew they weren't great. I remember in the 90s, we had Partnership for Peace. And remember, I flew this Hungarian MiG-29 pilot with the F-16. He could not fly the F-16 sim. It wasn't like he couldn't push the button. He just would crash it. And I remember thinking, and when Germany reunited, you know, at Laga, they had MiG-29s, and
Yep.
they brought the former East German pilots, and they eventually just had to be done with it. They couldn't fly anymore. Their mind just did not work, you know. And there's this mentality, and I found it with cosmonauts. The only thing, we would do a big simulator in the Russian segment, and the only thing they cared about afterwards was not getting blamed for anything, because there's a culture in Russia, you know, if you get "Кто виноват, а что делать?" So who's guilty and what do you do about it? And they send them to the gulag. And so there's this culture of not how to get better. Like if you and I went out and fought, if you were the general and I'm the lieutenant, but you fucked up, I would be like, dude, well, you know, that would come out in the debrief. But that kind of honesty, trying to get better, does not exist. I think there's a cultural problem when I look at their not knowing. I don't have any classified information. I'm just saying that's my take on it, is cultural.
No, it's huge. So come back to the framework of how they operate. So Ukraine for Russia, logistics, right? It gets to train networks in Russia, and then outside of Russian borders, those networks don't work anymore.
Right.
To what you're talking about in how they flew, central command and control is how they operated in those days of the Soviet bloc, where they were told what to do. Even today, they're told what to do. They go up and fly the specific task they're told what to do, and they come back and land. Now, can I just go to Laga for a second? So for folks that don't know what we're talking about, Laga, L-A-A-G-E, is a former Eastern, I think it was a Russian MiG-21 base near Rostock in what was northern Eastern Germany, now northern Germany. And it's where the MiG-29s that the East German Air Force had, when the unification happened, the West German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, took over, and they were all based up north. The Eastern Bloc, as you said, pilots never made it. Either they were linked to the Stasi, which was the secret service, or they were just so horrible they couldn't stay. And the Western pilots came in, and it was a fabulous place to go.
It was awesome.
I took Eurofighter, when I was a Eurofighter test pilot, I took one of our prototypes up there, and I did a week and a half, 2 weeks of radar work against. The final exercise was every flyable MiG-29 in Germany flew up against me in my Eurofighter in formations that we'd set up to evaluate the radar. And I had an amazing week with the MiG-29 guys up in Laga. So that's my Laga story for you, by the way. Eastern Bloc pilots, they can't think autonomously like we have. They're a narrow skill set. They only knew the tasks that they had, and that was it. Their training, it was never broad enough. They couldn't do suppression of enemy air defenses, like you know from the F-16 world, the wild weasels for the airplane.
That was my mission at Spangdahlem.
Yeah. So it's Vietnam era gets into the F-16. It's what you just said that you did at Spangdahlem. Remarkably complex mission to do. Well, that's really missiles, chasing down surface-to-air missiles and shooting them, attacking them necessarily, is what that task is. And they are incapable, as we saw, of doing that. Their training with precision-guided munitions was clearly atrocious and way behind. And that's all about practice, and that's all about lessons learned over time. And somehow they missed all of that. I think we overestimated them because their experience had been in Syria, which was an environment where the threat really wasn't very lethal, and they necessarily controlled what was happening there. So they weren't getting targeted and have the risk of being shot down. And so they walk into Ukraine and took a massive hit, outnumbered the Ukrainian forces 10-1. And now they're backpedaling. Way overestimated by us. But I think we always knew, as you alluded to, that their skill set was so weak, was so shallow, and it will take them a generation to recover from this. The airplanes are not as sophisticated as we thought. Yes, like a flanker that you mentioned at the Paris Air Show, it can go a long time. It can carry a lot of bombs and missiles, but it's not very survivable. And clearly the defensive systems that protect them didn't work.
Right.
So their systems aren't not as capable as we thought. And I think let's come back to Top Gun Maverick. They're not trained as good as well as we are. They are not as capable as Western men and women fighter pilots.
Yeah, I remember at Laga fighting the MiG-29. I was across the circle, so canopy to canopy, 2 miles apart, and the dude called me dead, with an art. And I was like, man, but it was a West German pilot flying it, and the MiG-29 had the helmet mounted sight, so he could look 90 degrees off his nose and shoot this amazing Russian missile. So they have good powered thrust to weight ratio. They have good missiles. They have, in some ways, their equipment's good. I don't want to dogfight a flanker against a good pilot in an F-16, but to fight a war against them when you're talking about IADs, all the radars, all the control systems, add in all that stuff, and they're just not, they're nothing. They can beat Syria. They can bomb Chechnya to the Stone Age. They can bomb Georgia to this. They can pick on little kids. They're a bully. They're like the 12-year-old bully on the playground of a bunch of 8-year-olds out there. But you bring in, the teenager and he's running with his tail between his legs. So it's
let's come back to something you talked about too, the blame game and the Russian cosmonauts.
Yeah.
And you use the example of a lieutenant flying with a general. So for non-aviators in this listening to us, when we in the Western world fly and whatever mission we do, we take the time to debrief what had happened afterwards. And when the door is closed in that debrief room, the ranking person, the person in charge is the person that led the mission. So the lieutenant or the young captain could be in charge of a colonel and a general and a major. And it's that captain who's screaming at the general, screaming at the colonel about how they screwed up. And what happens in that debriefing is to extract all the lessons that we can all learn from in the mission, so that we're all safer, we're all more effective, we're all better. And when the door opens at the end of that debrief, the captain's back into being a little captain. He's saying yes to the major, the colonel, and the general. But everybody has learned from it, and the egos are parked. And the collectively, we all get better. Whether you're a Dutch or Danish, you're German, you're Canadian, you're American Air Force, American Navy, American Marine Corps, we all subscribe to that. And we all collectively get that much better over time. We're not covering our ass after a mission trying to not get caught of what we did wrong or blame someone else. We all take the ego hits of what we did, and we learn constructively from that, so that we all we're safer and we're more effective moving on. Our training mentality allows us to create the great fighter pilots we have, but allows us to be dominant against like-minded, like-equipped pilots from the Eastern Bloc. If you had flown your F-16 against an Eastern Bloc MiG-29 pilot, you would have kicked his ass. And you would have kicked his ass because he wouldn't have had a clue to what to do. We know that as we westernized the air forces, starting in East Germany, but Poland and the Eastern Blocs, as we trained them on our Western ways, we found out how backward they were. Can I give you one fun anecdote? There have been lots of intrusion or close calls at Western flown patrol airplanes near China. And back this spring, Canadian Marine patrol aircraft, P3s essentially, they're called Auroras in Canada. They had some close calls with some Chinese flanker pilots. So Chinese fighter pilots came by them, and the Chinese pilots were giving them the middle finger, or flipping them the bird. And I remember the reporters asking me about what I thought of this, and I kept thinking, where in Chinese culture would that hand signal come from?
Top Gun.
Yep. So what did they learn about being fighter pilots? They watched Tom Cruise and Val Kilmer from 36 years ago, and that's where they're getting their tactics of how they think we fly in the Western world.
Were they inverted?
No, they weren't upside down with
in a negative 3G dive. Well, it's interesting. I hope, I would think, with the adherence to the Chinese Communist Party and the Big Brother and all that in China, hopefully the Chinese pilots are as inflexible as the Soviet East, the guys that you and I grew up against. But I guess that's to be seen. I
Well,
I haven't heard about Chinese pilots.
they outnumber us. Look, they've never been in combat.
Right.
What did we learn when we came out of Vietnam, end of Vietnam, got to Gulf War I? And while it was a massive success in the beginning, there was lots learned when we finally as Americans got back into combat. Found out, holy cow, we have a long way to go. We had to shake the peacetime Air Force from us. They've never been to war.
Mhm.
You know, your plan's only as good as your first contact with the enemy. The enemy has something to say. And so I would always be concerned of their aggressiveness. Their aggression. I would be concerned with their vast numbers compared to what we have.
Mhm.
But pound for pound, I'll take a Western trained fighter pilot any day.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And hopefully it doesn't come to that, but the the trajectory that they're on is not. Hope isn't a strategy. I hope it doesn't happen, but we need to be prepared, I think, to protect Taiwan or South Korea, especially, or Japan. We have a lot of friends in that region, so hopefully we'll.
Ukraine has woken us all up, right?
Yeah.
The lackadaisical attitude of 30 years post Cold War. I really thought my two boys would never live in a world of danger.
Yeah.
But it was always out there. It's
It's
lurking.
naive. Human nature is human nature. Real
You know
quick,
what?
you were talking about debriefs, and I think that's one of when I do speaking for companies, I always talk about the importance of having a culture of debrief. And in the Air Force, you don't kill somebody if they make a mistake. You debrief it and you figure out how to make it better and not have it happen again. If they commit a crime, if they're intentionally doing something bad, then that's when you pull the trigger. But not literally, but you know what I'm saying. You need to have a culture where if people mess up, a lot of times in the squadron on Friday afternoons, we'd the last guy lands, turn the beer light on, and we'd all get together and basically make fun of each other for who did the stupidest things of the week. And that was so healthy because I always said I want to learn from other people's mistakes, I don't want to make them myself. And a real quick story, my first flight as a CFI, so I'm the flight examiner, I'm the guy that gives check rides to the other pilots to sign them off as it's another year, you're still qualified. The first guy I had to give a check ride to was a colonel. We called him Bum. He was guard bum. He was a guard, old, crusty, ancient colonel. He was based in Germany, flying F-16s, and we do an instrument check. So this is like the easy check ride. It's just you go do some instrument approaches, land at some runways, and it's not like a tactical check ride. It's just your basic flying check ride. And he was sucked. Like in the pre-brief, I asked him what his bingo, like how much fuel he would need to have before he had to turn around and come home. And he's like, I don't know. And I remember thinking, huh? You can't, that's the basic question number one. And he flew below minimums and he just made a couple of really terrible mistakes. So I get back and I'm like, I'm going to have to bust the colonel. And this is the first check ride. And no one ever busted check ride in the F-16 squadron. In pilot training, yeah, people fail. But once you're in a squadron, that very rarely does someone fail a check ride. And this is my first one. So I go look for the ops officer. He's not around. I look for the squadron commander. I'm like the only guy in the squadron. And I had to sit the colonel down and fail him on his first check ride. And I can promise you, in the 1,000 years of Russian history, never, ever has a captain ever told a colonel anything.
That's right.
But you know what that man did? He came back to the squadron and he left his staff job. He read the book, the -1 and the -3-1, and for a week. And he went and had a good check ride. And it was like, he was like, yeah, you're right, I sucked. And so anyway, that culture of being able to take criticism is critical in fighter, and it's critical in other aspects of life too.
Well, so you talk about it in the business world, which
Yeah.
often is not healthy. It's often toxic with big
Right.
booming personalities.
Right.
And you have to create a culture of where there's psychological safety,
Mhm.
where men and women can speak up and aren't afraid, because they actually may know more than the booming voice of the leader. They
Right.
actually may be smarter. And we know that in the flight test world, we want to empower so test pilots fly with big control rooms supporting them, just like
Right.
at NASA. In F-35, I never, ever flew without a control room directing what we're doing, sometimes 40 or 50 engineers in there. And I want everyone to be empowered. I want the 24-year-old, barely able to shave young engineer, when they see something wrong, I want them to speak up. And I don't want them to be intimidated because I happen to have a big booming voice in a fighter cockpit. I want them to go, holy cow, stop, something's going wrong, and to arrest something before we really have a catastrophic event happen. And in the business world, you want the young analyst to go, holy cow, this is wrong, stop quick, I see something that's going bad, we're in real trouble. But if you don't create that culture, they're not going to speak up. They're just going to sit back there quietly and let you, let the company, let the boss fail and let the company fail, because they didn't, they weren't given a culture where it was encouraged for them to speak their mind with no threat of something happening to them, like you're talking about.
If you shoot the bearer of bad news, the good news is you're not going to hear any more bad news, but until it's too late. Yeah. So anyway, that's one good trait of being in some ways it's funny. Fighter pilots are kind of like millennials. Millennials don't really like rank, and everybody's the same, and they'll say what they think. So we're kind of like the original millennials. And that,
I think in that world, it exists less so now, but in my world, it was Friday night. We all went to the officers' mess in Canada, or the officers' club in the United States. I spent a lot of years flying in the States, but we always went there on Friday afternoons, and it was our TGIF. And one of the things we did is we drank too much beer, but we yelled at each other. We call it the 40 PSI fingers. We poked the fingers in the chest of our bosses, and we just get it out of our system. And it was our way to manage stress relief. So that when we came back to fly Monday, we forgot everything that happened Friday night, except for maybe paying for the glasses we broke or the pianos we burned.
Or the piano. The Brits always burn pianos.
Oh, they burn pianos. Absolutely. And so what we did is, it was stress relief, right? We got rid of it so our heads would be clear to go then the next week. We didn't carry the baggage with us, and because we couldn't afford to. We were so busy in our cockpits that we didn't need emotional baggage with us, or toxic cultures in our squadrons and with our mates. And that's the effectiveness of, in that fighter pilot world, that culture. And if we could translate that somehow, minus the beer drinking, in the civilian world, then the cultures in businesses would be healthier, and folks wouldn't have emotional baggage, the toxicity of the business world, and they would be more effective. They would be better. And oh, by the way, they'd want to stay longer. If we could translate some of what we learned in the military world to that, I think we could help the civilian business world.
That's a good thing. Cancel culture makes my head explode, and I hate it. But the biggest worry today seems to be to not offend anybody. And you shouldn't be a fighter pilot, at least back when I was a fighter pilot, if you didn't want to be offended. And there's something really healthy about, having a little bit of having thick skin to a certain extent. I mean, you can't take it too far, but
humility kept, you said it also, you didn't want to live around long enough to make all the mistakes, or you weren't going to live long enough to make all those mistakes. The humility also comes with, everybody makes mistakes, and if I make a mistake, I'm going to die. So I really do need all those people to hammer me when I do something wrong. I really do need to put my ego, keep my ego in check. And this isn't Hangman or back in the original Top Gun, Maverick and Iceman going at it. That doesn't happen. And those egos keeping in check keep us humble, because we're not good enough to know everything, and we want to stay alive at the end of the day. That's what that whole culture gave us.
Billy, I could talk on forever. There's something really good about the fighter pilot universe, and I think the world has lost something through political correctness and our inability to have that. So hopefully I think it'll come back. The pendulum always swings, and look, Top Gun Maverick, people love it. It's not, so, and the lessons that you're talking about, I mean, those are great things for businesses, any organization, to have these lessons. Are you doing that now? Do you do consulting and speaking and stuff?
I lecture at the International Test Pilot School, which you may not have heard of. It's in London, Ontario. So here I'm talking to you from now in Canada, not at my home in Pax River, Maryland. And here in Canada, west of Toronto, between Toronto and Detroit, is London, Ontario. And there's a test pilot school there that has been in place for some time, teaches students from around the world, not just Canadians, but really around the world, test pilots and engineers, and does fighter lead-in training fighter pilots for different air forces. I lecture there and I mentor there. I love being around bright young minds and engineers that can do anything, and students that really want to learn. I love going there to be a part of that. And I also lecture out in the real world, lived 40 years of a kinetic lifestyle, and I'm still alive. And there's some things that I learned along the way that helped me be effective, not just as a fighter pilot, but to survive
Right.
in a fighter jet and all the things that I did flying. And I translate that into the real world, because I think that there are lots of people that speak about their lives, and as you do, and we all try to address not the 3% of CEOs, but the 97% of people that just live lives day to day. And I think our lessons as fighter pilots and test pilots, what we learned along the way, what we gained in wisdom, can be directly translated into the civilian world to help folks run their businesses better, or just live their lives and control things a little better than they might have otherwise. I think we have some gems, a couple nuggets to pass on. And so I still enjoy, or I really do enjoy doing that.
I'll have to sit on one of your lectures. I'm actually going to be in Ontario in a few weeks for a National Geographic thing, so I'll let you know when I'm up there. I'm not sure what.
Yeah,
that would be cool. That'd be cool. You know, when people ask, if I had to say, if someone said, Terry, what are you? Or like professionally, what were you? Or what, you know, I'm an accountant or a doctor or whatever, I would say fighter pilot. I love being a test pilot was cool. Being an astronaut, obviously, most people would say Terry was an astronaut, but like who I am, I think, is a fighter pilot. And this has been really cool to talk about all this stuff that I haven't been done for many years, but it's pretty awesome. And if there's any kids out there that want to be fighter pilots, man, it's good work if you can get it.
Pretty special time. You know, kids, young kids in college right now are going to go fly 5th generation F-35s. They're going to wear a helmet that costs $400,000 that lets you see through the skin of the airplane. There are 8.6 million lines of code power in F-35. That's better than, I flew an airplane that's better than any video game that anyone has touched to date. And that was just my day-to-day job.
And it has a gun.
And by the way, it has a gun.
For now.
You know, if you want to motivate people, what kids right now, men and women or boys and girls in school, let them go see what an F-35 does. And I can't, and you know, it leads to many things, right? It leads to, you've talked about it, it's access to space. The world is just exploding in what we can do in our future. And it starts with flying a fighter. So if we could tell kids, 15-year-olds, you know, what we do, what we really get to do, they'd spend a little more time in math and physics in school and a little less time in their basement with their left and right thumbs, platinum thumbs, which, by the way, is a skill set you need to be an F-35 test pilot or F-35 fighter pilot. But if they knew just how bright the future was, we wouldn't be struggling so hard in STEM projects to try to get kids interested in what's out there, because it's a fabulous future. It's just miraculous what they're going to be able to do in aviation moving forward, and you know, ultimately into space too. I wish I could tell the story better and get closer to boys and girls that just don't know, to help motivate them, to tell them what's out there. And by the way, Top Gun Maverick does some of that. It's going to do what 36 years before. It's going to be that. It's going to motivate boys and girls to go, I can do that cool stuff. Hopefully.
That was a cool movie.
Cool
well, Billy, thank you for coming on. This is a lot of fun. I know I've taken a lot of your time, but there's other stuff. I wanted to get to the number of times that we almost died and tell war stories. We ran out of time. Maybe we'll do this again, just tell safety stories. But thanks. If you love the podcast, please subscribe and hit like. And thanks for joining Down to Earth with Terry Virts.